YouTube community, it's your favorite apostate and undude 2 here, once again, exposing Watchtower inconsistencies and freeing you from the prison of your own mind. So, anyway, I'm just getting home from work and I figured I'd do a video. You know, I had this on my mind. I was thinking about it earlier today, just going over some mental notes and references and experiences that I had while growing up. And what brought this on was a talk that was given at the Theocratic Ministry School yesterday, and it was the last part. So for those of you who have Kingdom Ministries, I invite you to open them up and look at what the last part was. For those of you who don't, I'll go ahead and explain it. What the part called for was, it was to be given by an elder, and he was to interview a spiritual family who was doing demos, or who were practicing for the field ministry while they did their family studies. And he made a couple comments which were interesting. Like I said, what brought all this on? First, he mentioned at the onset of the interview that it was very hard to find people who were actually doing this. Of course, I don't suppose he called the whole congregation, but, and that's probably a point I should bring out. Mind you, this elder, he's from my congregation. He and I switched congregations about a year ago. He went because he was needed. They only had 3 elders in that congregation, or 2. No, they only had 2 at the time. And I went because I was sick of being in the congregation I grew up in. And it's worked out fairly well. I enjoy the people there. We have good conversations. Even though they are, brainwashed, I understand. I have pity for them. I try and share with them what information I can. We have good conversations, but obviously nobody there knows I'm an apostate. Ooh, scary, scary, scary. Anyway, so he mentioned that it was very hard to find people who were actually doing this. The second thing that really piqued my interest is he called for a show of hands. Show of hands? Well, what do you mean an undude 2? He asked for everybody in the congregation to raise their hands if they conducted, or if they practiced for the field ministry during their family study each week. I didn't raise my hand, obviously. But what piqued my interest is I panned my head around and I looked at the elders. None of the elders raised their hands. I panned my head around and I looked at the pioneers. None of the pioneers raised their hands. I turned completely around and I looked at the publishers. None of the publishers raised their hands. Nobody in the entire building raised their hands. Nobody was doing what the governing body suggested. So you might actually be sensing why I enjoy this congregation. They're more real probably than most other witnesses you'll meet. And then he, of course, the elder from my congregation, he would have gotten a totally different response in Raymond Park, but he's kind of taken aback by this. He didn't expect it. So I don't think this was on script or on cue for him. Then he asked, well, how many people are doing the family study each week? I looked around. Most of the elders raised their hands. I did see one guy in the back who must not have heard. I'm sure he's doing it in actuality. I looked around at the pioneers. Not many of them raised their hands. And then I looked at the publishers. Not many of the publishers. I'm going to estimate that around a quarter of the people raised their hands, and 75% admitted that they were not having regular family studies. I'm just going, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but I am going to say that most witnesses, when the book study was cut, said, thank God. Because that's a good chunk of your time. You're talking about 3 days a week, plus study time, plus getting ready, and travel time. Especially if you have kids. Jesus, I can't even imagine going through that, but having to get everybody together, getting in your Sunday threads and trying to impress people. That's what it is. It's not about looking good for Jehovah. It's about impressing each other. Come on. It's not in the Bible where you have to wear a suit. Don't argue that. If you want to make a rule, fine, whatever. I understand that clubs have rules, clubs have requirements, but don't try and argue to me that it's scriptural, because you know it's not. There's no scriptural basis for that. In any event, it was funny because, you know, I liked that. I was pretty pleased. I'm like, you know, good. These people aren't wasting their time. They're enjoying their week like God made it to be enjoyed, instead of studying a Watchtower. Jeez. But it got me to thinking about my own experiences during the family study. And as most of you probably know, my mother is considered to be, well, she's essentially a proxy elder. She is the woman that the elders and the weak sisters to be encouraged and strengthened. She's the pioneer that gets her hours every month, and more so. I forget. It was funny because they announced the statistics one time that there were 16 Bible studies that had been conducted for a full year in our congregation. And I had to kind of chuckle to myself because she had 7 of them. She's super pioneer, okay? And even when we still had the book study night, you'll recall that the Watchtower did want you to have a family study night as well. That wasn't invented in a post-book study world. And we would study that thing, I mean, for hours. And initially when I was young, you know, pre-teens obviously, we would just study the Watchtower magazine essentially, and we would read every scripture. And this would go on, these would be not just, you know, an hour token service. This was full-on study sessions. It'd be like 3 hours we'd have to this. Now, of course, the reason why I had so much time to do this was because I was homeschooled. But in any event, and I got to thinking about when it turned. Of course, it was just boring when we were studying the Watchtower, but when it turned, there was like a tonal change in the message. As every child develops and grows, they begin to form their own opinions, their own viewpoints, their own morals, their own values. As did I. I was an independent thinker. There's my problem right there. I thought independently. But, you know, I began to expand my intelligence, and my mother sought to curtail this using her best buddy, her old pal, the Watchtower. And so the family study night, while maybe, depending on the person, they would have viewed the Watchtower as being encouraging, it literally turned into weekly attack sessions, where she would bring up my negative personality traits, and we would study on how to combat these. And it started to be personal attacks. Every week was like that. And it got to the point, as, you know, of course I grew more and more independent and had stronger feelings on my opinions and my, you know, formulations of thought, that we would end up going in these knuckle-dragging, you know, baritone shouting matches. You know, here's this pioneer who would literally be shouting down her son, and without making it sound dramatic, there was physical abuse that went on, where she would hit me, and you know, it was nothing extreme. Obviously, I didn't ever get a black eye or, you know, bruises or anything, but she would smack me or, you know, punch me in the gut or whatever, because she would get so mad. And well, that's a different story. It stopped. Okay, you know, I don't want a pity match here, but or a pity party here. But anyway, it got to the point finally where we were unable, and you know, of course, this would be followed up, these shouting matches, with pretty much a weekly visit with the elders. And you know, I suppose the reason really why it's so important to me that not only I do videos, but apostates around the world do their videos, is because these stories need to be shared. Every witness has their own unique and horrifying experience that needs to be told. And, you know, just to give you a little bit of insight, I suppose, on myself, there have been some negative thought patterns that have developed as a result, specifically, of my experiences growing up as a Watchtower. And you may not believe this, but I feel whenever I walk into a room, and this is changing, of course, as I've freed myself mentally, but particularly when I'd walk into a room full of witnesses, I would feel like I was disliked, that nobody liked me, that I was an embarrassment. And I believed it. I'm not trying to sound haughty or being a braggart, but I was very thorough when I was Jehovah's Witness. I would do as much as I possibly could, and yet I felt like it was never enough, and that I suppose the best way, I felt small. It was hurtful. Yeah. And that's why I've developed, I suppose, the personality that I have, because in an effort to mask this and compensate for it, I learned to talk well, to express myself well, and to develop myself on an intellectual level, to be able to project an aura of self-confidence. So, I mean, of course, ostensibly this would be to attract other people, but really it was to make myself feel more secure in an incredibly insecure environment on an emotional level. In any event, this finally it stopped. About 2 years ago, when I was 16 years old, was the last time that I ever had another family study. And what it was, we were at another family's house, and she was using them to gang up on me. And every week we would discuss, again, my negative personality traits or issues where they felt that I could improve. And this particular family study had to do with the value of entertainment. I'd never seen an R-rated movie. I didn't own an M-rated video game. I didn't have any violent comic books or gory or anything. Okay, it was just as pure and as censored as any witness could possibly expect. And they were telling me about how, R-rated movies are so bad, and it was accusatory, as though they had some evidence of me doing something that I had never done. And this family, I knew they were backing her up, and I lost it. I was sick and tired, so I got up from the comfy chair where I was seated in, and I went over to their entertainment center. This was in the living room, and I began tossing out their DVDs and their video games. I pulled out the drawers, and I began tossing it out. M-rated games, R-rated movies. I think they even had a, what was it, Basic Instinct? Hypocrites! Assaulting me, a devout Jehovah's Witness at the time. And maybe this was the turning point. Maybe this is, I never really can be too sure why I decided to examine the Watchtower for what it was, but maybe that was why. I don't know. Who knows? But, they got mad, started yelling at me. Oh, how dare you do that? Well, it's not, it's good enough for them, is what I came down to. It was good enough for them, it was not good enough for me. I said, I will have nothing to do with hypocrites. I made my stand. I marched out the door. I brought my Bible with me, and this is something, I reflect. I brought my Bible, but I left the literature. And I got in my truck, and I put it in reverse, and I drove off. And I never had a family study again. And this is why I think it's important that these videos are made. I hope, this has been of some benefit to somebody, obviously, but that's why. Because every witness has their own horrifying experience that needs to be shared. This destructive cult needs to be exposed. And I'm not advocating that people leave the organization if they don't want to. I can't make anybody do anything that they don't want to. All I'm interested in is that they examine an alternative point of view. I don't care. I don't want people to follow me. I want people to examine the Bible for themselves, come to their own independent conclusions. But I realize that that's never going to happen if they do what the Watchtower says. So, running short on time here, so I will leave it off with life is a state of mind. I hope this benefited somebody.